In A Game of Thrones, we hear about a relationship between Ned Stark and Ashara Dane. This relationship is shrouded in mystery, however, it's likely of utmost importance. After all, when Robert's rebellion ended, Ned dealt with the siege at Storm's End, then went to the Tower of Joy, then visited Ashara at Starfall before heading back to King's Landing and home to Winterfell. So who is Ashara Dane, and what happened between her and Ned? Well, what we know of Ashara is very little. According to Barristan Selmy, she was Elia Martell's lady-in-waiting, which means she likely knew Elia Martell very well. Barristan found Ashara very attractive and regrets not winning the Harrenhal tourney so he could crown her Queen of Love and Beauty. According to Meera, her father Howland Reed kept a close watch on Ashara at Harrenhal. He saw that Ashara danced with a number of men including Oberyn Martell, Jon Connington, and maybe her brother Arthur. She eventually dances with Ned, but only after Brandon talks to her first. Barristan thinks she was dishonored during the Harrenhal tourney and looked to Stark. However, Barristan likely has a different moral code than the Dornish. According to Edric Dane, Ned and Ashara at some point fell in love, and Edric believes Ashara committed suicide because Ned broke her heart. Harwin, though, thinks her brother's death had something to do with her suicide. At some point, Ashara seems to have gotten pregnant and had a child. Cersei and Catelyn think that she is the mother of Jon Snow. However, Barristan believes Ashara had a stillborn daughter. And yet, Barristan also thinks Daenerys looks a lot like Ashara, so the idea of Ashara being Dany's mother has also been introduced. According to Catelyn, Ned visited Starfall after killing Ashara's brother at the Tower of Joy. Ned was supposedly returning Arthur Dayne's sword. Ashara later kills herself by tossing herself from a tower into the sea, though according to our author in an August 2000 interview, her body was never found. Now, despite Ned killing Arthur and not returning his body, and perhaps driving Ashara to suicide, it seems House Dane has a good opinion of Ned. After all, Edric Dane goes by Ned, so it seems Edric was named after Eddard for some reason. So the Ned and Ashara story is filled with holes and a few contradictions. So what do we really know? Well, not much for sure. We don't even know if Ashara is dead or alive. We don't know who specifically she had a romance with. We don't know if she had a boy or a girl. We don't even know if her child is alive or dead. However, it seems that Ned and Ashara were actually in love. Ned's emotion about Ashara seems legitimate, and Edric Dane is probably the most trustworthy source on what really happened with Ashara. So let's start with that. Ned and Ashara were in love. But then weirdly, we get a third character, Brandon. Meera makes a point to say that Brandon talked to Ashara first, and Barristan says that Ashara looked to Stark. So our author has quite deliberately made things vague here. Did she look to Ned, or did she look to Brandon? Or did she look to both? Our author has introduced the idea of a love triangle. As it turns out, our author frequently writes about love triangles and how painful unrequited love and jealousy are. In fact, let's talk about George R. R. Martin's love life for a moment. We know that in his mid-20s, George R. R. Martin had a relationship where his girlfriend left him for one of his best friends. Soon after, he then fell madly in love with a feminist sci-fi writer named Lisa Tuttle, who then also left him for someone else. Lisa remained good friends with our author, which likely gave him continuing agony. The pain from these two relationships was brutal for our author, and if you've ever been dumped for someone else, you know how bad it feels. On top of the feelings of loss and loneliness, there are toxic feelings of inadequacy and jealousy that linger for way too long. Our author shows his pain in several stories he wrote around this time, and in my opinion, these stories are his best, most powerful work. There's This Tower of Ashes, where the protagonist is visited by his ex-girlfriend and the friend she left him for. There's Meathouse Man, where the protagonist is left for someone else by girl number 1, and then is left for his best friend by girl number 2. And there's Dying of the Light, where the protagonist goes off to find his ex-girlfriend and becomes entrenched in the problems of her new husband. Now, these stories were all written in the 70s, but the specter of love triangles, unrequited love, and jealousy continue to haunt our author. In Dream Songs, this is what he said about it. While 1973 and 1974 were great years for me professionally, they were by no means happy years. My career was going wonderfully, my life, not so much. I was wounded and in a lot of pain. I put it all into Meathouse Man. Even now, almost 30 years later, I find it painful to reread. If it was still painful 30 years after the events, it was still painful 20 years after the events when he wrote A Game of Thrones. And of course, writers draw from their own experiences, which would explain why there's so many love triangles in our story. Consider the following triangles: Cat, Lysa, and Littlefinger, Jaime, Cersei, and Robert, Tywin, Tyrion, and Shae, Robert, Lyanna, and Rhaegar, Dany, Daario, and Hisdar, Brandon, Cat, and Lady Dustin, Bloodraven, Bittersteel, and Shira Seastar, Jorah, Lyness, and the Lyseni Prince, Sweet Robin, Harry the Heir, and Sansa, Irri, Jiqui, and Ricardo, Jaime, Cersei, and Lancel, Osmond, Kettle Black, and Moonboy for all I know, Theon, Ramsay, and Kira, Asha, Carl, and Christopher, Victarion Euron and Victarion's wife, Tywin Aerys and Joanna, Aegon the Unworthy, Aemon the Dragon Knight and Nerys, Aegon Rhaenys and Visenya, Stannis Melisandre and Selyse, Pate, Rosie, and Lazy Leo. And on top of all of those, consider the following situations of unrequited love. Jorah and Dany, Bran and Mira, Tyrion and Sansa, Sansa and Joffrey, Sansa and Loras, Viserys and Dany, according to Illyrio, Barristan and Ashara, Cersei and Rhaegar, Arya Hota and Arianna, Quentyn and Dany, Brienne and Renly, Jon Connington and Rhaegar. Unhappiness with regards to romance is everywhere, and in the rare case of a bona fide requited love like Dany and Drogo, or Loras and Renly, or Jon and Ygritte, we get tragedy. So it's quite clear that our author frequently writes about love, but specifically unrequited love, and usually love triangle situations. So based on this pattern, and George R. Martin's life, I would say there's a very good chance that indeed there was a Ned, Bran, and Ashara love triangle. And if we're following our author's life as the archetype, I would say it's likely that Ned and Ashara had a brief love affair before she left him for Brandon. Now one could say, sure, a love triangle, but why not Ashara leaving Brandon for Ned? Sure, maybe, except that's not the way our author's stories work. The male point of view protagonist is the heartbroken, not the heartbreaker. We can go back to the extensive list and check for ourselves. Tyrion, heartbroken and jealous. Victarion, heartbroken and jealous. Jaime, heartbroken and jealous. Barristan, Quentyn, Jon Connington, Arya Hota, Chet, Pate, Dunk. It's a pantheon of heartbroken sad sacks who don't get the girl. Dany, Cat, Cersei, Asha, and Sansa can be heartbreakers, driving men to jealousy, but never our men. And that fits with our author. He's not the heartbreaker, he's the heartbroken. So let's review what is likely. Number 1, Ned and Ashara were in love, and this is based on Catelyn and Edric Dane's knowledge. Number 2, Ned, Ashara, and Brandon were in a love triangle. This is based on Mira and Barristan's stories, along with our author's life and other writings. And number 3, Ashara left Ned for Brandon. And this is based on our author's life and writings and the general pattern that the male point of view character gets dumped. Now, if we accept that Ashara left Ned for Brandon, this means that Brandon is the likely father of her child. After all, an Ashara pregnant with Ned's child is unlikely to leave Ned for Brandon. And this brings us back to our author's love life. After his heartbreaks, George R. R. Martin married the author Gail Burnick, which ended in divorce. Later on, he met Paris McBride. Incidentally, both Gail and Paris had red hair, which may be why it's so prevalent in our story. Anyway, our author and Paris McBride remained together 30 years without getting married. Now, based on our author's life, specifically his unmarried time with Paris, it doesn't seem he values the institution of marriage very much. After all, if our author thought marriage had value, you'd think he would have married Paris after, say, I don't know, 16 or 17 years of being together. Of course, the two eventually did get married, but it should be noted that there's a very large financial incentive to marriage with regard to the American Social Security system. You get 50% more Social Security benefits when you're married, and your surviving spouse gets your benefit for the rest of their life after you die. Over the course of a retirement, specifically Paris McBride's retirement, which will likely last 30 years, we're talking about close to $1 million in benefits. And by the way, Social Security is something you can start taking at 62, the very age George R. R. Martin and Paris were married. So it seems our author values marriage very little. So I wonder, how did young Ned feel about it? After the Tower of Joy, Ned headed to Starfall. But for what purpose? Returning a sword? Seems unlikely. If he cared about honoring a house so much, why didn't he return Arthur's bones? Arthur's bones were left in the Mountains of Dorne, an action that some, like Lady Dustin, would find insulting. It seems Ned's trip was not about honoring Arthur Dane, but seeing Ashara. It should be noted in our author's stories This Tower of Ashes and Dying of the Light, our protagonists have reunions with their exes, like Ned. And in both cases, despite being honor-obsessed men, they secretly want to get back together with their long-lost loves. And so I do wonder if Ned came to Starfall ready to abandon Catelyn and run off with Ashara. After all, he'd only spent 2 weeks with Catelyn, on arranged marriage. It's unlikely he valued her very much at this point. And Brandon is dead. Ned may have been hoping to patch things up and run off with Ashara. The possibility of doing this must have at least passed through Ned's head on his long ride from the Tower of Joy to Starfall.
Ashara, my love, the woman that hurt me. Gods, I was a fool. But maybe we can make it work. I won't screw it up this time. My Jenny.
Oh yeah, there's Jenny. Maybe I should explain who Jenny is. It's kind of important. As I mentioned, in our author's work Dying of the Light, our protagonist, Dirk, goes to meet his ex and wants to get back together with her. Her name is Gwen, but our protagonist calls her Guinevere as a loving nickname, or Jenny for short. It should be noted that Guinevere was in a love triangle with King Arthur and Lancelot. Anyway, Dirk lovingly calls Gwen Jenny, but eventually he finds out that she utterly hated the name when they were together. Jenny was the fake woman our protagonist created in his head. She was the princess, the woman on a pedestal, a figment of Dirk's imagination. You're Jenny, you're Guinevere. You said that over and over again. You called me those names as often as you called me Gwen. I wanted you to love me, not her. I was Gwen Delvano. And I wanted to be the best Gwen Delvano I could be, but still myself. I fought being Jenny, and you fought to keep her, and never understood. And that's why I left you. And it's no coincidence that Kat used to play Jenny of Oldstones with Littlefinger, a man who put her on a pedestal and had delusions about their relationship. So Dirk had this concept of his Jenny, one based on old stories of knights and honor, and Gwen, a strong woman, rejected it, wanting to be seen for who she really was. And writers write what they know. George R. R. Martin is a nerdy guy from New Jersey who grew up on stories of knights and superheroes. Stories where women are classically portrayed as damsels in distress who need protecting and saving. Does that sound like Dirk? Yeah, absolutely. Does that sound like Ned? Yeah, absolutely. However, the women that George R. R. Martin ends up being attracted to in his life are all feminists. In fact, Lisa Tuttle even wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Feminism. And her author's now wife, Paris McBride, used to wait tables at a lesbian feminist restaurant. These aren't women who would appreciate being thought of as damsels who need saving. Do these women sound like Gwen? Yeah, absolutely. And of all the places in Westeros that would respect feminism, it's Dorne. Do these women sound like Ashara? Absolutely. So we can see the fundamental dynamic between George R. R. Martin and the women in his life is the same as that of Dirk and Gwen. And it's likely the same dynamic between Ned and Ashara. It's also the same dynamic between Jon and Ygritte, Jorah and Dany, Aerys Oakheart and Arianna. They're all men in love, discovering how to set their sexist ideals aside. So it may be that Ned headed to Starfall, possibly to be with Ashara, and possibly to set his northern patriarchy aside. Except if you've ever tried to get back together with an ex, you know that problems arise. You realize that there are a lot of things you've created in your head about the relationship. You realize that expectations aren't reality. Plus, there's baggage. Sometimes people make it work the second time around, but usually they don't. After all, there's a reason you broke up in the first place. Would Ned and Ashara really work out? Probably not. But even beyond that, all of those babies kind of screw everything up. Ned has likely come with a baby from the Tower of Joy, and Ashara may have a baby as well if it didn't die. And at Starfall, Ned would have likely gotten news of Robb's birth. And there's the Tully-Stark alliance to think of. After reconsideration, it's pretty clear that Ned and Ashara's love could never be. Their personalities are likely too different as well. And there's the realm to think of. In the end, it just wasn't practical. Just as Jon chose duty over love, Ned likely did the same thing. But just because a relationship doesn't work out and is filled with misperceptions and self-delusion and baggage, it doesn't mean that the feelings aren't real, and it doesn't mean that the feelings aren't powerful. One big theme of our author's work is the obligation we feel because of love, even unrequited love. The protagonist of Dying of the Light feels he needs to sacrifice himself to let his ex-girlfriend and her husband escape. Except by story's end, he realizes that his mind was filled with delusion about the relationship, and he knows it won't work with Gwen, and he knows that Gwen and her husband probably won't work either. Still, he feels obligated. It's almost as if he feels obligated to the memory of love, or the principle of love. For our author, despite being dumped, he still felt obligated to Lisa Tuttle. He remained friends with her and helped her write Windhaven, which really launched her career. And take a moment to think back to your past loves, even the ones that didn't work out, even the unrequited ones. If they asked something of you, would you come through for them? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. It probably depends on the request. Still, it's hard to deny that there isn't some odd, lingering sense of obligation floating around inside of you. And I imagine this Dirk and Gwen, Martin and Tuttle sense of obligation existed between Ned and Ashara. What that obligation led to is the $64,000 question. If you watch my videos, you know that I think there was a baby swap. But even if I'm wrong about that, it seems Ned did something for Ashara out of obligation. An obligation that endeared him to House Dane. Ned left Starfall with Jon, Lyanna's bones, and a refusal to ever speak of Ashara Dane. And Ashara? Well, if she's not dead, it's hard to say where she went. There's only two other living people that we know Ashara knows. They are the other men she danced with at Harrenhal, Jon Connington and Oberyn Martell. Two men who were in Essos at the time. Jon Connington did mysteriously turn up with a kid, Aegon, and a mysterious woman named Lemore is hanging around him, and she's about the same age as Ashara. And Oberyn Martell did mysteriously cram himself into the life of Viserys and Dany. He first vowed to raise Dorne for Viserys, and then negotiated a marriage pact involving him. And Dany seems to remember lemons from her childhood, something Dorne is famous for. And another mysterious woman is stalking Dany's dreams and guiding her through her life. It's almost as if our author is purposely screwing with us. The living men that Ashara danced with all lead to the stories of Jon, Dany, and Aegon, 3 children with dubious parentage. But no matter what the truth is, it's hard not to see the parallels between Ned and our author. After all, A Game of Thrones opens with Ned having spent 15 happy years with red-haired Catelyn. That happens to be the same amount of time our author had been with Paris McBride when A Game of Thrones was published. And Ned was still sensitive about a brief love affair with a feminist. Writers write what they know. To really know what I'm talking about, you guys should read This Tower of Ashes, Meathouse Man, and Dying of the Light. I've left the links below to both the audio and the written. Once again, I'm probably wrong about half of this.